It's really good to see people again. This is lovely. This is lovely. Thank you all for taking time out of your lives to be with us today. I think we've put together something that's, I won't say unprecedented, but it's pretty extraordinary. We're dealing with some pretty intense schedules here, and to try to get them all together in one place at one time, let's just say it was tricky. We are coming to you from the Mars Discovery District in downtown Toronto, and I think that's kind of appropriate because across the road from this place is another place where these folks spent a collective 93 years of their lives. And of course, I'm talking about Queen's Park. Now, one little reminder, none of these people is elected anymore. They're not getting paid anything to be here today. So let's be appropriately respectful with our questioning, and remember that the only person who's allowed to ask rude, obnoxious questions is me, okay? Good. Applause, applause here. Thank you. And with that, let's welcome them out here, shall we? He was the first Liberal Premier in 42 years when he was sworn in 1985. The 20th Premier of Ontario, David Peterson. There you go. Far chair for you. Thank you. He was the first and still only NDP Premier in Ontario history, the 21st Premier of Ontario from New York City, Bob Rae.
Nice to see you all.
He was the first in 7 decades to become Premier without having a seat in the legislature, the 23rd Premier of Ontario, Ernie Eves. There you go. Thank you. Right beside David. He was the first Liberal Premier in 128 years to win 3 straight elections, the 24th Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty. There we go. Thank you. And finally, her place in history shall always be secured as the first female Premier Ontario ever had, the 25th Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne. There you go, Premier, right here. Thank you. Now, a couple of housekeeping items just before we start. Mike Harris actually agreed to be here today. And business, unfortunately, took him away. He's over in Europe right now, but he had agreed to be here, and I just thought I'd put that on the record. Sure. Second, don't be mischievous already.
Sorry.
Second, Bob Rae very much wanted to be here as well with us in Toronto, but as he announced on Twitter last night, Mr. Rae has COVID. So he was not allowed to, obviously, come out of isolation to be with us today. But we are delighted that even though I suspect he's not feeling his best, that he's put a suit and tie on for us, and he's on the line from New York City, which is terrific. And can I just also say, speaking of Mr. Rae, let me take this opportunity to say that I know we have all been, I can't believe that's my phone that's ringing, after I told everybody else, to turn their damn phones off, and I forgot to. I know we have all been mortified by watching what's been going on in Eastern Europe these days, and as disgusted as we all are with what's happening courtesy of the Russian military in Ukraine, I suspect I can speak on behalf of everybody here in saying how proud we are that our UN ambassador is representing us to the world so well these days. So I would put that on the list. And with that, I'm grateful to all of you for coming here, and Mr. Rae for being on the line from New York City. We want to talk off the top about what we all think the people of Ontario had to say a week ago today, last Thursday. Why don't we go in inverse order? Kathleen Wynne, what did the people of Ontario say on June the 2nd?
Meh. I think people were very tired, are very tired. I think the voter turnout kind of indicated that that apathy. I mean, the pundits will examine this and pull it apart, I'm sure, but I knocked on a lot of doors. I was out with candidates mostly in the Toronto area. And the undecided vote was very late. You know, there were a lot of people saying they were going to decide. I don't know if they went to vote or not. And I think COVID really knocked it out of us. You know, I think COVID was a big factor. And it was not a change election. There was not an appetite for change.
Dalton McKinney, what did the people say a week ago?
Well, I was thinking about working on my brother Dylan's campaign, and then my dad's campaign, and then my 6 campaigns, and my brother David's 7 campaigns. And I must have worked on at least a dozen other campaigns, starting with John Turner in 1968 when he's Minister of Justice. I have never seen an election like this one.
How so?
Well, I attended 5 rallies, and had you fired off a cannon at these rallies, no one would be in danger of being injured. Maybe that was a function of the ticket. And on my street, by way of another little anecdote, there was one sign on my lawn. Normally there's a healthy competition for attention, and the signs go up in the spring like weeds. So it was a very, I think, unique election, and I think it would be a mistake to draw too many lessons from this particular experience. But in addition to what Kathleen said about exhaustion stemming from us having to cope with COVID, I think there's another, perhaps more ominous undercurrent, and that is waning confidence in politics, politicians, and our public institutions. If you take a look at the last Edelman Trust Barometer, they tell us that now 60% of us, 60% of Canadians, no longer have faith in their political leaders, business leaders, or in journalists. The last I can understand. You know, so that's a real issue, Steve, and we're going to have to find a way to address that together.
Which we shall tonight. Ernie Eves, what did the people say a week ago?
Well, I think Kathleen hit the nail right on the head. I think that it was not a change election. The people of Ontario had just been through 2+ years of COVID. I think they were very tired, which they have every right to be, and they just want to get on with life. And I think that, you know, from their point of view, it was better the person they knew than somebody else who they didn't know. And that's not unusual in elections or in life, as a matter of fact. And I don't think that, you know, with all due respect to the other 2 main leaders, I don't think anybody lit a fire under the public for change. And I really think that the people of Ontario had probably made up their mind. Lots can happen during a campaign, there's no doubt about it, but I think the people of Ontario had already made up their mind what they were going to do. And hence, I think that accounts for some of the low voter turnout. I would agree with what Dalton said about people's lack of faith in their institutions. I mean, I'm criticizing some of my federal brethren here. When you start talking about firing the governor of the Bank of Canada, or making cryptocurrency your currency, or firing the head of the chief medical officer of health, you're really undermining the very system that we have to believe in to succeed as a democracy. And it's very, very important that people respect their institutions and that they respect and that they respect the people that represent them. And I think politics has become far too polarized, far too partisan, and nobody gets together and compromises on anything, it seems to me, anymore. But I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
Sure. Let's hear from Bob Rae. Mr. Rae, what did people have to say in this province a week ago?
Well, I had the distinct disadvantage of not being there, and I think it's the first election in many, many over the last nearly 40 years that I was not knocking on doors. But my impression really coincides with that of the others, except to say in addition that Mr. Ford won. And I think it's important to respect the voters who voted, and it's important to understand perhaps why that happened. I do think it's true to say that no one else was able to excite or create the momentum for change. And as it turned out, the election itself didn't make that much difference. But I think it's important for those of us who, and I have to be careful what I say in this program, Steve, because I am a public servant, so I can't make any particularly enticingly controversial statements, which I would normally do. I do think that it is part of a broader series of events around the world, where I think in many, many countries, we see the same things happen. And unless somebody was able to light a fire, as Ernie put it, and really provide a compelling reason for a complete change, I think the status quo is what was reelected. Although I would warn you that when status quos are elected, they're often not the status quo, because the world around us is changing so quickly that governments are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And I think they're going to surprise many of the people who thought that they were not going to see any big change.
David Peterson, what would you add to the record here?
Well, I'm embarrassed. I agree with all of these people. It was a snoozer. And I think people saw it that way. But I just hasten to form too many conclusions about the state of the world based on one election. My experience with elections is, I hate to tell you this, but it's leadership matters. People form an association with the leader. They like you or they don't like you, and sometimes they like you, and sometimes they don't like you. I can tell you that as well. And that's the nature of politics. And you're never facing the Almighty in an election. You're facing other mortal human beings. And if you do a better job in that 6-week period, then you tend to win. If you don't, you lose. And, that's just kind of the way it is. The other thing I'd be careful about, I think, is saying people don't care about politics. Even though volunteerism is way down, you juxtapose this with what's happening with the federal Conservatives. I don't like what's happening with the federal Conservatives, and I don't like anything that Mr. Poilievre represents. But I have never seen, except perhaps with the exception of Trudeau Sr., the kind of excitement that he has generated, the crowds he has pulled out. All the while the crowds were diminishing provincially, they were being enhanced federally. And thousands of people were coming out, new people. Now, I think he's tapping into some pretty dangerous stuff. I don't want to get into the substance of that, I'm prepared to. But what I do say is people are still looking to politicians or the political system for some kind of solutions to their dilemma. And that's a very, very active scene. When any party that can sell 600,000 memberships for leadership has got a little bit of fire underneath it, and for better or for worse, I'm glad it's not my problem, because I actually agree with everything Ernie said. But people have not completely given up in politics, and I would certainly hope they don't anyway.
Well, let me pursue that a bit here, because I guess the first big story on election night was Doug Ford got a second mandate. I think the second big story of election night was 43.5% of the people eligible to vote cast a ballot. When you heard that number, what'd you think? That's the lowest ever.
Yeah, it's the lowest. Well, I mean, it goes along with what I said to start out with, which is I think people were not engaged, and I don't know the extent to which it's a generalized comment about politics. I kind of agree with David. I think that if people feel that there's something they can connect to, whether it's a grievance or whether it's an aspiration, then they will engage. They didn't feel that, I guess, during this election, and I worry. When I heard the number, I worried. It makes me very concerned for the democratic process in the province, but in the country.
Do you share that concern, Dalton McGuinty?
Yeah, I maybe am a little bit more pessimistic than my colleagues here. In terms of where we find ourselves at, I'm very optimistic about finding ways to turn this around. But the data clearly shows that with the passage of time, there has been a steady decline in our institutions. Churches, academics, media, politicians, business leaders, and the like. I like to say the age of deferentialism is now behind us. And nobody is, your opinion is now just as good as mine. And the challenge, I think, is we're going to need to find a way to build a bit of common ground. We have got people peeling off on the right, perhaps in one of the parties. We might see somebody encourage people to peel off to the left, but the place where we can build a future together is on some common ground, and I like to think that's largely in the center.
Well, I don't want to take the media off the hook on any of this, Premier Eves, because pretty much for 3 or 4 months leading up to the election, if you turned on your television, read something in the newspaper, there was almost always a reference to, sure looks like Doug Ford's going to be reelected with a majority government. Do you think that depressed the vote?
Yes, I do. I think that a lot of people thought it was a foregone conclusion. A lot of conservative voters probably thought it was a foregone conclusion. Why bother showing up? He's 10 points ahead. He's going to win anyway. So why would I bother? That's unfortunate, but I think it also has an element of reality to it. I really think that we have to restore our faith in our institutions and the political process, which I agree has probably diminished somewhat over the last few years. I think a lot of it has to do with people not respecting other people's opinions. It's very polarized, it's very partisan, and if you say it's right, I say it's left. If you say the number's 9, I say it's 2, and there's no numbers in between, apparently. I really, I go back to my time in politics. I know I'm a little older. Arrived at Queen's Park in Bill Davis's government in 1981. I was 34 years old.
Won in a landslide, if I recall.
Yeah, a landslide of 6 whole votes. Thanks, thanks for reminding me of that. but I did win 8 elections and didn't lose one, except to him, of course. But I didn't lose my own riding ever. Anyway, having said all of that, I was House Leader for a number of years. House leaders, we used to meet for lunch. We used to talk about, well, what do you want? I was there with Jim Bradley, David Cook. And obviously we didn't agree on everything, but we found a way to make the system work. We found a way to appreciate other people's points of view and build it into legislation. And unfortunately, I think we've lost that now to a large extent, and we're gonna have to find it again. And it's gonna have to start at the top. I mean, leaders are going to have to be above this extremely partisan, parochial point of view, in my opinion.
Let me get Bob Rae, then Dalton McGuinty, then Kathleen Wynne. Bob Rae, you don't get rewarded for being pragmatic and moderate these days necessarily. You get rewarded by stirring up the base. So where's the marks in this to try to get along with others?
Well, Phil Gibbons, who's the former mayor of Toronto, once said to me, in the way that only he could, he said, Bobby baby, he said, in this game, you don't get what you deserve, you get what's coming to you. And that's what it is. That's what happened. That's what happened. I have to say I'm a little less gloomy than seems to be the consensus. I could say that from a personal point of view, I was not shocked by the result. And I think it's, living here in the United States, where obviously the news around me is even more divided and polarized than it is in Canada. And look at the news from the UK. I mean, what we're seeing in other countries, this is a very common, widespread phenomenon of which we are now a part. But the other thing I think is that institutions are, of course, excuse me, important, but the most important thing is people. And I think that people don't have a great sense of what the future is going to be like. Don't have as much confidence, I think, as we would all like them to have. And objectively, they face some very tough situations. The world is changing fast. Many people can't afford to buy a house in metropolitan Toronto or in other cities. Work is not an easy thing. The world of work is changing. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. And COVID itself, here I am speaking to you from my garret in my house. COVID makes us very isolated. It has made us isolated. It has made us more private. It has made us more looking to ourselves and our families. And there's been less opportunity for public engagement. So I don't read too much into the election. And I was always comforted by the thought that I've always had is that everybody overreached their mandate. Everybody thinks, oh, I've got a mandate now. It's going to be 4 years, clear sailing. Well, ask Boris Johnson how that went. You know, it doesn't work like that. And we also tend to, and the media does it too, is we exaggerate the permanence of defeat. No party was, none of the three major parties in Ontario were obliterated in actual numbers. I mean, the vagaries of the first past the post system produced some wonky results, as it always does. It elected me premier in 1990. How's that for a wonky result? So I think we're exaggerating. People say to me the Liberal Party's finished. People said that federally when I became the interim leader, and I had to spend quite a lot of time telling the caucus, I've seen this before. We've been through this movie before. I know what it's like, and we can come back. And we did with the new leader. And I think that's very much how people have to be thinking. It's not the end of anything. It's the beginning of some stuff. And yes, there's some problems. The low turnout is problematic. But a lot of the people who didn't vote, probably felt don't worry that much about it. I have to look to myself for so nobody's putting anything in front of me that says, yeah, this is what I really want. So they'll go with what they've got, you know. And I think, for example, on a very practical issue, which actually I'm quite interested in on this highway that's going across the province, across agricultural land. I don't think anybody should say, I've got a mandate to do that, and say, no, you won the election. That's it. Nothing else flows from it that's a logical conclusion.
Premier McGuinty.
Sorry.
Let's get Premier McGuinty, Premier Wynne, and then Premier Peterson.
It's been said that you can only lead with the consent of the led. And I think we should start by, I just want to second something that Bob said a moment ago, understanding where people are at right now. I think broadly speaking, there are maybe two different periods in history, being overly simplistic here. One is where we kind of, figuratively speaking, lock arms and we march forward together, and we're looking up in optimism at what more we could build together. And there are other times in history where we feel very much isolated, we're on our own. And instead of looking up in hope, we're looking down in despair, in fear of what we might lose. And I think that second period is probably more characteristic of the times than the optimistic period. That's the first point I wanted to make. The other thing is, I want to come back and build on something that Ernie said. You know what, one of the things I discovered is the way we conduct ourselves in politics. If you go sit on a hospital board or a public or a private company board, the way we treat each other is completely unacceptable. You're not going to see GM taking out an ad attacking Ford. You're not going to see Apple attacking Samsung. You're not going to see Tim Horton attacking McDonald's. Because what you do is you end up undermining confidence in the category itself. If I attack you, ultimately I diminish myself. That's the challenge that we have. Not easy to pull out of that nosedive, because the truth of the matter is people also are very much drawn to clickbait. Show me somebody smacking somebody, right? So we are in this together. We've got a fabulous foundation on which to build. I'm convinced we can get there, but let's start by acknowledging some of the challenges we've created for ourselves.
Premier Wynne.
I want to say two things, something about kids and go back to your question about the media. So in terms of the disengagement, I've had the opportunity over the last year to spend a lot of time with kids who are granted in university courses, so they've already decided they're going to be engaged in politics in one way or another. But they are very, very eager to see people working together. They're not disengaged in the issues. They're not interested in the antics of politics. That's my experience of young people. And I was working with a first-year class and a fourth-year class. They want to know that there's going to be a solution to some of those intractable problems that we know we're confronting, and they don't have a lot of patience for the antics, you know? And I think a lot of them don't vote because of that. You know, I mean, I know the younger age groups tend not to vote as much as we do. Those of us who are old, we vote, which I always tell a young person, you know, if you don't vote, then somebody who looks like me is going to vote for you, and that's not a good thing necessarily. So I think that, you know, to suggest to a young person that there's a debate about whether we need to tackle climate change is ridiculous, because for them, it's their lives, you know? They know perfectly well that we need to be doing more, and they have no patience with the discussion about whether we need to do more. And so I think on some of these issues that are threatening our lives, the life of the planet, we need to find a way to be better about working together. The second thing I wanted to say about the media, Doug Ford got a pass in this election. He got a pass, he was allowed to hide. The media did not force him. You know, not only was there the suppression of the vote by the assumption that he was going to win, but when he decided not to come out, you're one of the few journalists who actually named that and said that, you know, he wouldn't come and meet with you. So that's a problem, and I don't know how it gets resolved, but I think it needs to be named, not just about him, but about politicians who choose not to engage with the public. That's what democracy is. And if we don't have that, then we don't have public discourse, and that's a huge problem.
Premier Peters.
I'm very surprised that nobody has mentioned the impact of social media. I think the world has changed underneath our feet. As I think the point's made, volunteerism is way down. People couldn't get crowds. When I had hundreds of people working for it, thousands of signs. Now, you know, they're lucky to get 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 professionals to take polls and then and go out on social media on their behalf. Look what's happening in the States. Look what's happening here. And look at the successful people are mastering the new ways of communicating, which one-on-one puts everybody pari passu. See, the function of a political party, like an old line newspaper, if I may say, is to curate. You know, you have somebody with an extreme view here and somebody with an extreme or crazy view over here, and you come back with a moderate view. That's what leadership, the Conservative and the NDP party and the Liberal Party have always been done, and always been able to hold that together and articulate a view that held enough people inside the tent. Now, everybody's view is sort of equal. Everybody gets equal access through the social media, and it is a cacophony of noise and different truths. I mean, there's so many fantastic things being said publicly that are just perfectly untrue, but people believe them. Look what's happening in the States, but it's happening here as well.
Premier McGuinty.
A reason for optimism. All right. I'm not sure it's ever not been fashionable to claim cynicism. You've seen it all. You know it all. There's nothing new under the sun. I can't be moved, and I sure as hell I'm not going to be inspired by you. But here's what I learned about people during the course of my time in politics. That cynicism is really not much more than a thin veneer. And deep down, there is this primal yearning. People understand, somewhere in our lizard brain, life is very short, and then we're dead for a pretty long time. And they want to know that they can make a real and lasting difference. They want to do something good with their lives. And the responsibility of principled leadership is to appeal to that primal, fundamental yearning to make a difference and to do something good. And I think that's one of the challenges we have today is, look at
religion does. Religion always offers you something better. You never know for sure it's going to work out, but that's why a lot of people are religious.
Well, which is why the point I want to make is, if you want to be my leader, don't be selfish, shallow, small-minded, and short-sighted. I can do that on my own. Help me be me at my best, because at our best, We're kind and caring and thoughtful and considerate and resilient and resourceful and determined and courageous. And our best, we're wise and we're compassionate. That's what we need now from our leaders. Speak to what is best in us, because it's there.
Let me put a few numbers on the table here, and then I'll get Premiers Eves and Ray to comment first about this. The other night, the New Democrats got 1.11 million votes. The Liberals got 1.11 million votes. One party got 31 seats, one party got 8 seats. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times since last week. We got to get rid of this system because it creates these crazy anomalies. Premier Eves. Yes or no?
It was always thus. Everybody, that doesn't mean it has to always be that way, but everybody on this stage has benefited from the first past the post system, and everybody on this stage has suffered from first past the post system. I don't say this disparagingly at all. I really like Bob Rae, and I regard him as a friend, and I always have. We play golf together from time to time. Bob Rae got less percentage of the popular vote than Frank Miller did in 1985. Yet Bob Rae had a huge majority, and Frank Miller had a slim minority, which turned out to be turfed out due to the agreement, the accord between Liberals and NDP. But what goes around comes around. The NDP has always been extremely efficient at knowing where they have a chance to win, where they do not have a chance to win, and making sure that they get the maximum number of seats they can out of their support. I'm generalizing here, but the other two traditional parties, the Conservative and Liberal Party, they try to compete in virtually every riding across the province, et cetera, or across the country, as the case may be. And that may not always result in seats. I mean, you win some seats by the narrowest of margins, you win other seats by huge majorities, you get 80 or 90% of the vote, and you put it all together. It doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, that because those percentages of the vote don't reflect the number of seats, that it's a bad thing. When you look at proportional representation around the world, and I'm sure Bob will have something to say about this, and others will, a lot of countries that have proportional representation, it doesn't work too well. And the reason is because, in my opinion, because you get so many different parties. You get a party with 2 people in it. You get a party with 12 people over here. There's a party with 8 people over here. And so now you end up with 20 parties sitting in the governing body, whatever it is, the legislature in this case.
Knesset.
And yes, exactly. And the governments change. Things don't get done. You're always trying to appease the 2 people over here because you need their support or your government's going to fall. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing. I also think we have to think in terms of one shortcoming of our political system, not just ours, but democracy. When you have like a 4-year mandate or a 5-year mandate, I don't care who they are, yes, you would think that you would want to do what's going to be good for the people of Ontario 50 years from now, 100 years from now. But all too often, the closer it gets to election day, we're doing what's good for the next election time, and then we'll worry about the rest of it later. And there's lots of things that different governments start. The succeeding governments turf, not because it's not a good thing, they turf them because, well, David Peterson started that. Why would I go on with that, even if it's the best thing since sliced bread, which I think is a very stupid and small-minded attitude. You have to understand what's in the best interests of the electorate long-term and hope that there's enough respect in the system that the parties or the governments that follow will respect those and they'll retain those.
Let's get Bob Rae on this issue. Everybody's railing about first past the post. Is this anything anyone can do anything about?
Well, right now, the only person that could do anything about it is Doug Ford, and he won't, because he's just won the election under the current system. I'm a practical person. The only time you're going to get any really real discussion about electoral reform is when you have a minority parliament, whether it's at Queen's Park or in Ottawa or anywhere else. as long as you have a majority in one party, they're never going to agree to it. I personally am in favor of proportional representation. I have been for some considerable time. I didn't do anything about it because I couldn't persuade my party that it should be a priority. And I regret that they said, look, we won the last one, let's hope we can win the next one. I said, don't be too sure it's going to work that way. But anyway, that's what happens. But I think the key thing is that it doesn't have to be the Israeli system or the Italian system or whatever system. You can create your own system of proportional representation. And the key way to avoid having too many parties is simply to raise the bar on how many votes you have to get in order to be elected. And that forces people to concentrate a little bit on what the real choices are. And you can also keep it with having, as the Germans have it, you can have people elected in constituencies and you can have others elected from a party list. It's quite doable. But as I said, it's only going to happen when you have a minority parliament. And even I would say when you have an election platform of two parties, an agreement to say, we're going to do this and we're going to figure out how to do it, we're going to do it. Now that didn't work for Mr. Trudeau in the first term because there was a disagreement about what it meant. And that led to nothing moving. But that doesn't mean it won't move again. And I do believe that it probably will produce a higher level of participation. And I think that's one of the key things we got to be aiming for, because people will feel, well, my vote will count somehow. And I think the more you can create that sense in people, the more likely they are to vote. And I worry particularly not about the 43.7% number for the whole population, but if it's that number for the whole population, it's probably much, much lower for younger people, probably 2 to 1, probably 1 out of 3 people between the ages of 18 and 25 or 18 and 30 voted. And that's terrible. I mean, that is not a successful electoral system.
Dalton McGuinty.
I think we should be mindful of something that Churchill once said, which is that democracy is a terrible system, but for all the others we've tried from time to time. Remember, this democracy of which we are complaining today gave us this building, our extraordinary public education system, our extraordinary public health care. None of these are perfect, I get that. But it is the foundation for the rich freedoms we enjoy, and the great quality of life that we share. That's our system of democracy. Point number 2 is that I did bring together through a citizens assembly process 2 people from each Ontario riding, brought them together over an extended period of time, and they met with experts who schooled them on some of the options, some of the possibilities, and better informed them about our system as it existed. And we gave them the option to put forward an alternative. They did come up with an alternative. We did present it to the people of Ontario at election time, and the people of Ontario turned it down.
Big time.
Yeah. So I'd be careful about saying the problem is the system itself. I think that we need to recommit ourselves. We need to find a way to appeal to the better angels of our nature. I think that idealism is there in our young people, as it's always been. They've turned off our system of politics. And I think that's a function of the way it's devolved.
And can I just make a point too, because Ernie, you were talking about the swings from government to government and the undoing of work that had been done just because of partisanship. And I lived in a Western European country for a period of time in the 80s, and it seemed to me, and it was a long time ago, but it seemed to me that there was a stronger consensus about housing or about transit or about the assumptions about what people could expect in their communities than we have here. And the point I want to make is that I think that since that time, a lot of that consensus that we have had has broken down. And with partisanship, we see these assumptions that because you are a liberal or because you are a conservative or because you are an NDPer, that you believe certain things and that you believe them to be right and that you are going to therefore oppose me. And I think that is a problem. So if there is a way, I completely agree, we've got to recommit to the democratic process. But what that means to me is we've got to find some common ground and some consensus on these issues that are of such huge importance, and that, quite frankly, have nothing to do with political parties. They have nothing to do with partisanship. They only have to do with survival of the species and the building of a strong society.
Common
And
challenges.
get those agreements in place somehow, and then have all the fights we want, all the debates we want about the things around the edges.
Premier Peterson, you look like you want to get in. You've got that look on
Well,
your
I
face.
was just thinking, remarkably, both the NDP and the Conservatives ended up sort of more or less in the middle. Most people are reasonable. And I think there are consensuses. I think that we have to have a great healthcare system and education. So there are different ways of going at those things. Nobody's trying to tear it down and build charter schools, for example.
I'm not sure about that,
So
David.
I think, well, I don't think there's a secret agenda here. I really don't. And I think that, and by the way, if you do campaign from the edges, you always end up governing from the center anyway, because there are certain centripetal forces that drive all this together. So I think the issue, frankly, is leadership. And I think I'd be very, very careful to form a whole bunch of universal judgments based on this last campaign. It was a one-off. Anymore, you should form a whole bunch of universals based on when I won, or when Bob won, or when Ernie won, or when Dalton won. I think individuals, leadership at the time, and I think one of the great things about the democratic system, there are flaws in this, it's thrown up the leadership that's relevant at the time. The things that I could never get elected today, there was a point in time when I could, because I think I was in sync with what the province was doing. And I would say that for my colleagues as well. And I hate to say, there's a time when you're not in sync. And there's a time, that's when they throw you out. And Ernie's the only one that hasn't been thrown.
I was thrown out.
You were thrown out. Dalton's the only one that wasn't thrown out. So he doesn't know the joy of the humility of a real political career. He's just a boy. He thinks it's all fun, right? And it's not. But let me just say, leadership at the time matters. And I think it really depends on our capacity to throw up the right leaders at the right time. And I would, individuals can change the course of history. The history books are filled with that. And so I think we've got to put a real emphasis on growing those leaders and encouraging young people. And there's lots of ways to do that, because I can tell you, there's a lot out there. If you ever lose faith, just talk to some of the young people I've met through being involved at the university. I mean, they're filled with promise and optimism and generosity. They're not cynical yet. Let's not let them turn cynical too soon.
Well, I would just say the President of the United States is older than you. The Ontario Liberal leadership is available right now. Are you interested?
Well, I'm tied up this afternoon, Stephen, but I do appreciate the invitation. Maybe Bob will do it. Bob's a Liberal now.
Let me raise...
I can't say anything because I want to keep my current job.
Let me raise some troubling issues about legitimacy at this point. And by that I mean, Doug Ford got 41% of the 43.5% of people who voted in the last election. So he has 100% of the power with less than 20% of the eligible votes. And I'm not being partisan here, I'd say the same thing about you. You got 100% of the power in getting 38% of the 50% that voted, so you too got less than 20% of eligible voters, and yet this is what our system provides for. Is there anything, are we getting close to a level of illegitimacy about having all the power with apparently so little foundation underneath it? I don't know, I'm asking. Who wants in on that? Dalton McGuinty.
I think there's a legitimate fear, but if you have a responsible leader, and to give Doug Ford a little bit of credit, the night of his election win remarks, and he did the same thing the following morning, he said that he was going to govern for all Ontarians. And we're not interested in most Ontarians are not interested in his party or in a cause, whatever he might describe it as, but we are interested in our government, it's our government, seeing us, hearing us, and finding ways to recognize our concerns and support us as and when needed. So I think with responsible leadership, there are ways to justify the system as it exists at this point in time. I think where we could get into trouble is if we had somebody who was going to abuse that authority, that limited mandate. Steve, as I understand it, somebody told me that that Premier Ford got the support of 1 out of 6 eligible voters. If you take into account all those who stayed home, that's a pretty slim mandate.
Right.
So to me, I'm hopeful, and he made those kinds of sounds on election night and the following morning, that he'll understand his responsibility is to all of us. His responsibility is to find ways to bring common ground where we can all come together. And he has, I think, he got in there as a populist. He was going to be there to break up the furniture. Well, now he's rearranging furniture and building new furniture. He used to be the outsider, now he's the insider. He was the populist, and I think he's more of a pragmatist right now. So I think that there are forces at play. I think David made reference to those, Bob made a reference to those as well. When you get in there, I think most of us feel, I got to govern for everybody.
And let me just add that he is completely legitimate, and he has the right to do what he can get away with. Now, the question is, what can he get away with? And there are a whole bunch of things there that are constraining him. First of all, I guarantee you that 80% of the people will not like him in 2 years. That's not because it's him, just because anybody. There's a half-life in politics. Half the people hate you in politics anyway. And they're on the other team. Part of this is a team sport, but they don't want to see you succeed particularly. So he's got that. He's got a media that will be vicious. And he also has a backbench now, a large backbench. Trust me, a large backbench can cause a lot of trouble. But I don't want to get into that. And it's not easy, and they all have points of view. Bob alluded to Boris Johnson. That's a different system. There's far more hands in the power in the hands of the MPs than there is here. But let me tell you, there's lots of forces forcing a first minister to be humble all of the time. And if it's not them, trust me, it's your wife and your kids.
Bob Rae, can I get you on that?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think we talked a lot about institutions, and I think democracy is a lot of about what happens between elections. It's not just about elections. You're going to have, first of all, you're going to look at, well, what's happening in the economy. I think all the signs from from global institutions are we're in for a really rough ride. The global economy's in for a rough ride. And my experience in Ontario was when that happens, we're in for a rough ride, and it's not easy. So there's a lot of difficult things that are going to be facing them, that not going to be easy. I think that's important. The other thing is that there's a huge institutional structure to the province that anybody who's premier very quickly becomes aware of. Educational institutions, universities, churches, all kinds of institutional forces at play that are not irrelevant. And then there's public opinion, which is fickle, changes, moves, glides, shifts. But when it really moves, like Old Man River, when it's flowing, it flows hard. And if you come in and say, I'm going to just defy that, or I don't care what people think, I'm going to do what I think is the right thing, you're in for trouble. And I think that's something we have to remember. So as I said, I just think that we have to recognize that triumph and defeat are both imposters. There is no triumph and there is no defeat. Nothing is final. And life goes on. And the institutions are strong. I don't think anybody should challenge Doug Ford's legitimacy. Under our system, he won more votes than anybody else, but more importantly, he won far more seats than anybody else. That's our system. It's been our system since we developed the constituency system under Robert Baldwin in Ontario back in the 1840s. So that's the way it is. And I don't think there's no question of legitimacy. The question is, what does anybody do with their power? How do they exercise it? And what are the challenges that they're going to face? And I think that'll be the test. And frankly, it's going to up to the opposition parties to get their act together, to understand that their ideas and theories may be very interesting to them. But if they don't get in line with what the public thinks is important, they're going to have trouble. And I think that's something that everybody has to remember.
Yeah, and I just to build on what Bob is saying, I don't think the legitimacy is the question that is the most immediate concern right now. I mean, I think that he won fair and square, and we move on. What I'm worried about is the relationships. So those institutions that we're talking about are made up of people with whom government needs to have a decent relationship. So I got into this game because of publicly funded education. I'm very worried about the relationships between the provincial government and all of our educators in the province. I'm worried about the relationship between the government and the frontline healthcare workers. I'm worried about the relationship between the government and women, quite frankly, because those two groups that I just talked about, who run the most important institutions in the province, are women. They're not the private sector unions whose backs he was slapping and who he said there seems to be a great relationship. That's fine. But the women who are on the front line have been in neglected sectors through this government. And I worry that those relationships are fractured. And I hope that, you know, all you lovely, polite gentlemen, who I love, all of you, but you're very, very, you're willing to think the best of a person who I'm not sure is interested in rebuilding those relationships. I pray that he is. I really, really pray that he is, but that is what I'm worried about right now.
Let me give a 2-minute warning to this audience in case you want to ask questions. A microphone here, a microphone here. You can start to line up right now. I want to put one last thing to this group here, and that is, in Australia, they make you vote. If you don't vote, they give you a ticket. And they have a barbecue on Election Day. They have the elections on Sunday, they have a barbecue, people come, they bring the family, it's a festival. Should we do that here?
People think yes.
Well, I certainly think, I'm not sure about compulsory. I'm not sure it's in the culture at the moment. I'm not sure about it. But what I do think is that we should make it as easy as possible to vote, including Sundays, and we have, frankly, we can't say it's not. I mean, I voted from New York. I put a ballot in the mail, and I assume it got there. But I mean, you could vote in advance polls, you could vote in the periods leading up to that. There's lots of ways in which, but I think on Election Day itself, and we had a lot of problems on Election Day, which we should not have had. That should not have happened. The IT problems, all the other problems, that shouldn't have happened. But I certainly think we should be doing everything we can. I would lower the voting age to 16. I would get the high schools involved in encouraging, building up the civic culture much more strongly in high school. I would do everything I could to get people engaged and involved in the process. Okay. I'm not sure compulsory is the answer. I'm not even sure with the charter it would work. But anyway, that's just my view.
We've got long lineups of people here. Can I just do a fast survey here? Anybody here for compulsory voting? Anybody here? No, I'm seeing head shaking. No. Okay, just
16-year-olds voting, though, I think.
That's a good idea.
I think so.
Okay. Microphone 1, start us off, please. And remember, everybody, questions, not speeches. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. My name's Harvey Cooper, and thank you, TVO, Steve Paikin, and the 5 premiers for this event. It's truly extraordinary. I sit here and I'm actually struck by the insights, the wisdom, and frankly, your candor. We've got a tradition in Ontario, and it's, I think, true elsewhere, that those who've had positions such as premiers, when they, in whatever way, they're exited from...
Harvey, questions, not speeches. Look at the line behind you.
The tradition is that once you're out of public life, you usually don't say very much, at least in a public way. I imagine you're counsel to many people privately. When you spoke about hyperpartisanship, apathy, engagement, maybe there's a role, I'll put it to all the premiers, for being more public and sharing those insights in candor when you leave office. Your thoughts on it?
Ernie, would that be a good idea?
I don't.
Ex-Premiers Club? Get out there and...
Well, I'm on the John Oakley program. I'm not today, but I'm usually there from 5 to 6 every Wednesday. And I am quite frank when topics come up, when people phone in, when John Oakley poses an issue or question. I certainly don't always agree with the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. I mean, because I feel now I'm free to say whatever I want. I'm not bound by any caucus. And I think you've probably noticed the similarity among all the people sitting up here. I think David put it very succinctly when he said that, when you get to be in government, you are governing everybody in the province of Ontario. You're their government, and you govern from the center. You don't govern from the far left or the far right. Look at Bob Ray's example, for example. I think everybody thought that when Bob Ray was elected, oh, what have we done now? There's going to be this huge left-wing wacko government that's going to do all these crazy things. The only guy that didn't agree with you was Peter Cormos, as I recall, about auto insurance. But, so I think we can criticize our system, and there's no doubt it can be improved upon. But I think ultimately, my experience sitting in the Ontario legislature for 24 years, the overwhelming majority, I would say 99% of the members that were there that I served with in all those different governments were there for the right reasons. There's always going to be the odd person that isn't in any political party, but I really think we're trying to make lives of Ontarians better. We may disagree as to how we get from point A to point B from time to time, but we're all trying to get there.
Microphone 2, please.
Hi, my name is Alex.
Hi, Alex.
So my question is, you pointed out about the turnout and the low turnout, but this is something very common at the local level. And I'm just curious about the Premier's thoughts on, has this apathy, I would argue disillusionment, from the local level metastasize upward? As a 30-something Ontarian, it doesn't seem that the society has planned for the things I need, housing, daycares, you name it. And it doesn't seem that the political process is responsive. It seems everybody's kind of pointing at each other. Like, municipalities will say, like, oh, I can't do anything. The province will say it's their job to figure it out. And you see this apathy just building. The turnout we just had in Ontario, at the municipal level, that would be a good turnout. So I'm just curious.
Let me get Kathleen Wynne to speak to that, because you served at the municipal and the provincial levels. What do you think?
Yeah, and it's exactly, Alex, exactly what I was talking about in my conversations with the students this year. That's exactly what they said to me, is that they don't see their needs reflected in the actions of government, particularly on the big issues that they perceive shouldn't be partisan, that shouldn't be ideological. And so, I think that's the gap that we have to fill, Alex. And I think that one of the ways we do that is by finding ways to listen more closely to to young people. We're all quite old, and some of us older than others. But that means, to Harvey's point, we have experience, and that's very helpful. But we really need to find ways of drawing in your opinion. That's why I'm in favor of lowering the voting age, because I think that then forces schools to do a different job, have a different engagement with the electoral process than they do now.
David Peterson.
Let me just point out a perfect dilemma that we have. Right? Most of the young people I know care passionately about the environment, and are prepared to make the sacrifices and want the leadership to do that. Then comes along $2.25 gas. What's the best way to get cars off the road? Jack up the gas prices, right? And that's the biggest issue in town now, is the cost of living. It superseded that. So on one hand, and there's, let's say, 50 cents worth of taxes in every liter of gas. Governments could easily cut that on the cost of living issue, but they weigh that against the environmental side. You can see this Faustian bargain that these politicians have to make. Do we make gas cheaper so we get more pollution? and because people don't have enough money to buy gas or food. That's what leadership has to do, is explain those things, explain those trade-offs, and engage people in making those intelligent trade-offs. And that's what leadership is supposed to do, because you can't vote, if you vote on a single issue, and lots of people are very passionate about single things, but it doesn't help in our system when there's so many issues that a government has to handle. And you may not agree with any party on all issues. Don't expect to do that. What you're really looking for is more a set of values and centered people, I think, to address from a general point of view the things you care about.
Dalton McGuinty.
Well, you know what? There's a real tension. And maybe I can put it this way. You got to worry about what people think about you. But you got to worry even more about what you think about you. At some point, the music's going to stop, and you're going to have to get off the merry-go-round, and you're going to have to live with yourself. You're going to have to be able to look in the mirror and say, I did the best things that I should have done at the time. So you got to pick a lane. And David, you won't remember this because this happened about 100 years ago, but you told me when I was running for the leader of the party, you told me that just when you think you're going to be physically ill if you say it again is when people are hearing it for the very first time. So you've got to pick a lane, and you have got to prosecute your case. And here's something else I learned. Conviction counts. People want to know if you believe in it. They may not agree with you, but they're going to respect you if they get the sense you honestly believe this is what we need to do at this point in our history. So look, things are not going to get any less complicated going forward. And more the challenges seem to be more global in nature and call for a collaborative and collective response. So we're going to need leadership that's prepared to pick a lane and make some difficult decisions and some tough choices, and then say, this is why we need to do this, and devote considerable energy to enlisting people in that cause.
Microphone 1, please.
Hi, my name is Bilal, and I'll also pull out the young person card. I think the key takeaway here, and you all agreed with this, is that no one was really speaking to us. No one was speaking to the issues that matter to us, housing affordability. While there was chatter about not building highways, sprawling, etc., there was no urgency paid to building more housing in places where people like me want to live. So my question to all of you is, if I could give you a time machine or just a video recording thing and ask you to send a message to the next Ontario Liberal leader or the NDP leader, specifically around turning out and engaging with young people, what would that message be?
Message to the next leader of the NDP or the Liberals. Premier Ray, you want to take that on?
Well, I could legitimately say I can speak to both of them as an equal. So that's not a problem for me. And they can both ignore my advice. My advice would be to do what all leaders try to do, and it's not their fault if it doesn't gel or it doesn't connect or it doesn't resonate or they can't get the message across. I think people were trying to communicate it. I have two things to say. One is, in a lot of the way in which this issue is being placed in front of you, it's nobody spoke to me. Well, Palau, you speak to us. You step up. And I would have a message to the population is, if you want to get involved, if you're not happy with what you've got, then go out and change it. That's what my generation did. We didn't wait around for people to ask when we're going to do it. Ernie got into politics when he was 34. I was elected to Parliament when I was 30, and I was leader of a party when I was 33. You don't wait around. You just take stage. And it's time, if people say, well, you're hanging around too long, you say, well, okay, come on, you come in. I'm not leaving, but you can come in too. Nobody's stopping you. And the second thing I would say is I think the leaders really have to focus on what it is they're trying to do. A lot of the messages were these, Gainsburgers sort of campaigns where one day it's housing, the next day it's education, this day it's this, a little promise here, a little promise there. I think that formula for a campaign is tired. I was in that kind of a campaign for a while, and I don't think it works. I think you've really got to have a very clear overarching message, and I think you've got to keep your eye on the demographic reality. The next victorious party, I think, in the election in Ontario will be a party that is able to galvanize public opinion of all ages. Mm-hmm. And that process starts through the political process of getting elected leader, and then it goes on from there. And I think that's what you've really got to be prepared to do. There's no magic formula, but the fact is if there's a 60 or 70% turnout in an election, it will elect a progressive party. Of that, I have no doubt at all.
Microphone 2.
As one of the young voters with a bit of faith for the future, I hope I can alleviate some of the cynicism, even just a little bit. A good society is where the rich use public transportation. Active transport forces people to think about the common good, is better for health outcomes, and it's just really just nice. Now, Toronto has its fair share of problems. For one, the fact that our streetcars and buses get stuck in traffic. But this question pertains to all Ontarians. How can we change the car dependency culture in the suburbs and rural towns and instead invest in active transportation and, more importantly, step away from single-family zoning development?
Do you think it's not happening?
Slowly, I see it, but not everywhere. Not, for example, Windsor. My wife's from Windsor. Their goal for I just read this the other day, their goal for 2041 is to get to 25% for active transport users. Right now, Toronto is at somewhere, I think, in the 40%. So it's like, where are our goals, and how do we change that?
Let's go. Kathleen, will you
Yeah,
weigh in?
I just want to say, I think there's a provincial policy statement that lays out the expectations of development and things like transportation, not to as great an extent as it should. But I think that overarching statement that is kind of a unifying vision for some of these issues provincially, we need to push on that. That's where the articulation of the vision needs to be. And to the point that was being made before, if indeed this government, this newly elected government, is going to work for all Ontarians, then they should be open to that kind of approach, because the provincial policy statement is where that resides. And if we don't have the vision, if it doesn't start there, then it's very hard for municipalities to push for the funding, for example, the infrastructure resources that they need to build it. So I would push for that.
Sorry, David
I've
Peterson.
got a simpler solution. I know the complete solution to this problem. If I was the Premier, I'd pass a law that every single road that was built in Ontario or repaved had to have a bike lane on both sides.
There was a transportation minister once who did that, who said that the paved shoulders.
What was her name?
In 25 years, the entire province would have bike lanes. We'd all be on bikes. We'd all be healthy and look as good as you, and we'd have fun. Okay. And you can be leader of the party if you promise that.
Microphone 1, please.
Hi, so a question that I think kind of gets implicitly asked, I've heard people talk about municipal politics and provincial politics. Creatures of the province is something that really doesn't come up all that often. I remember in 2018 when Doug Ford interfered in Toronto's election, we got about 2 weeks of kind of coverage of questioning the role of creatures of the province in the 21st century. And with 5 premiers here, I'm just wondering, where the premiers, with that experience of having to deal with creatures of the province, where you kind of stand on how this fits into kind of this 21st century idea of democracy moving forward, perhaps less legitimacy for institutions. How does that kind of maybe fit in there?
Let me put this to Dalton McGuinty, because it was your government actually that passed the City of Toronto Act that gave more powers to a municipality, which I think a lot of people in the capital city appreciated, and now other cities want it as well. What do you think?
Well, I think fundamentally it comes down to a genuine desire on both sides to work as partners. The truth of the matter is that cities are creatures of the province, and there are times when those cities will be treated as full, mature adult partners, and other times where they'll be dismissed out of hand. So it comes down to me as a matter of relationships, and so I sat down. I think it was Mayor Miller at the time. We had some good conversations, and he made what I thought was a very compelling case. Toronto's unique in this country, by virtue of its size and other characteristics. And I thought it was important at the end of the day to give them additional authorities so that they could better meet their own needs. And I had lots of complaints from and concerns expressed by caucus, frankly. None of those ultimately manifested themselves in terms of blowback that affected me in a negative way.
Okay, I promised these five that they wouldn't be here all night long. So one more question here, and then we got to wrap it up. Go ahead, please.
I just want to congratulate you, Steve, for putting together such a terrific panel. Great discussion. My name's Howard Brown, and I've had the privilege of working with many of you, and I found the discussion very interesting. I just want to comment on just refer to three things. Premier Ray said public opinion is fickle. Premier Wynne said we need to find a better way to listen, and Premier Peterson said we need more leadership. And I'm particularly interested in the concept of finding a better way to listen. What recommendations would each of the premiers have to open up? And one of the thoughts I had is, one of the discussions was about universities, to maybe empower universities to put as part of the program, you know, Queen's Park, this is University Week this quarter, get the hell out of Queen's Park and go speak to kids in university and formalize some kind of system that legitimizes that way to be heard. Thoughts?
Let me get Bob Ray to start on that, because you were actually tasked by Dalton McGuinty to do a big study on universities. You made some recommendations. I think he actually took them. So why don't you start?
He did. He implemented them. It's
Yep.
amazing. Imagine that. I had more influence when I wasn't premier than when I was premier. Steve, if I don't have a chance, I did want to say that I feel that someone's missing from the program. And certainly that's Premier Davis. But I think he's in all of our hearts, because I think all the people on the stage would agree that he really created the mold for us in our generation of being a premier for everyone and of listening. I think the thing about listening is critical. You've got to listen more than you talk. We haven't been doing that today, but it's absolutely critical to do. And the other thing that's important is to have the courage to admit that you can be wrong, which I know my contemporaries will say, well, you know, you're not a very good example of that. But I would say it's really important to say in what we do is to listen more than we talk. It's to admit that we can be wrong. And it's to create the space and the culture around us and how we conduct ourselves that those two things can happen. It's it's a huge talent to have, to be able to really listen and reverse course when you have to, and admit that what you've heard from other people has actually changed your mind. But I can think of a few times in the legislature, not very many, but a few, where that's actually what I saw happen. People said, well, we thought this, now we think this. And there've been 2 or 3 moments when these events have taken place, and they're a good representation of how to do it. The great thing about the culture of technology that we're in today is that it's much easier to communicate with people around the world, but it's also much easier to communicate with people in institutions. There's no excuse for the premier not being able to talk directly on a Zoom call with a hospital board or with a university board or with students in a class. No excuse whatsoever. All you have to do is just engage and learn how to listen, and I think it can help to change the culture. We can become a learning culture in that regard, which I think is exceptionally important.
Premier Wynne, Premier McGuinty.
I just want to say something quickly. Howard, you know, I think we forget what a competitive environment we live in. And I don't just mean politics. I mean everywhere, in the classrooms, in our schools, in our sports, everywhere. Kids are competing with each other. And teachers are not necessarily taught how to help their kids and facilitate a listening environment. And so I think we have work to do in our institutions where our children are, so that they grow up to be people who learn to listen. I worked as a mediator for 10 years before I got into politics, and I had to learn that skill of actively listening. So I think your idea of formalizing some structures of actually understanding that it's a learned skill and that kids are not going to necessarily learn it at home, and therefore they're not going to necessarily be adults who listen, I think it's a really important thing that we need to think about.
There's a very heavy sense of responsibility and accountability that you feel when you become premier. And I can recall, especially at the outset, going into scrums thinking, I've got to have the answers. That's my job. That's not sensible. And I learned over time that collective intelligence and collective wisdom is so much better than personal intelligence or personal wisdom. And one of the regrets I do have, Steve, is we didn't find a way, building on that idea of the Citizens Assembly that we did at one point in time, to just harness the goodwill and the creativity of ordinary Ontarians in this age of technology where it's so easy to communicate with each other. We now need to give ourselves permission to move beyond this outdated notion that somehow we are the repository of all wisdom. That doesn't cut it anymore. Nobody buys that anymore. Deferentialism is dead. So we need to find a way to better connect with everyday Ontarians and perhaps consult them, get their views on different things. You know, we're not there. We're still thinking, you know, we're here, it's all up to us. That's not on anymore. You wouldn't do that in business.
David Peterson.
Well, all that's true. And we should all listen, and we should listen more. I should listen to everybody more, my kids, everybody. But at the end of the day, but that's easy to say. It's almost a cliche. At the end of the day, you have to make some decisions. If it was easy, somebody else would have made the decision. All the hard decisions come to the Premier, or setting the agenda. I can tell you some enormously difficult issues I had to deal with, like Meech Lake, the constitutional negotiations, and the State of the Union. And there was lots of opposition to that. But you can't be all things to all people. And let me just say, nobody at the end of the day wants a leader who says, vote for me and I will compromise. Even though there's a great tradition of compromise in Canada, this country was put together on compromise, and it's a great thing. But eventually, strong people had strong decisions, and they put their opinions and their reputations behind the creation of a new country, behind official languages, and all the things that are hard. A lot of hard things in this country, but we have to be principled at the end of it.
But listening does not preclude making good decisions. I can break cabinet.
Facilitates.
It facilitates. I can break cabinet confidentiality, because I'm the only one in this panel who sat in one of the other guys' cabinets, and I sat in Dalton's cabinet, and I watched him listen to the opinions of the people around the table. I watched him change his mind, and that wasn't a weakness, David. That wasn't, and compromising,
But at the end of the day, I'm agreeing with you, but at the end of the day, you can't be all that. You listen to everybody, and then you decide. It's my point.
There's no decision that's going to make everybody happy.
What did you change his mind
That's what you have to understand.
No, I'm not going to say that.
If you're in a mood to sort of violate conference confidentiality, let's go.
I'm just making a general statement about process.
Okay, Ernie Eves.
Well, I think a good leader surrounds themselves with people whose opinions are totally different. Yeah. Bob Rae mentioned Bill Davis. I was briefly in Bill Davis's government cabinet, and he surrounded himself with people from the far left to the far right, and he would listen to all their points of view. And then he ultimately knew that he had to make the decision at the end of the day. As David points out, that's the leader's responsibility to go forward. There are other leaders who surround themselves only with people who agree with them, and they have a very, very closed little circle. And one of my concerns is, not just here in Ontario, but in Canada, the government seems to be more and more controlled by 5 unelected people who are closest to the Premier. And I don't ever think that's a good thing. I mean, it's great to hear different points of view, but you should have the confidence, number one, you should be confident enough to listen to other people's points of view, admit when you might be wrong, as somebody else has pointed out here, or you made a mistake, and go forward on that basis. It's very simple, in my opinion. If you always do what you think the right thing is, regardless of the political consequences, you will make an awful lot of more good decisions than you will bad ones.
Just before we take the last question, since his name has come up a couple of times, and he's been out of public life for 37 years, so I'm not going to assume that particularly the young people here know who Bill Davis is. So, a quick word about that man whom you all know. When Dalton McGuinty's mother talked about the Premier, she wasn't talking about him, she was talking about Bill Davis. Because a lot of people, anyway, second longest serving Premier in Ontario history, governed as Premier from 1971 to 1985, and many would argue the gold standard for the job.
And for those that didn't know, Steve Paikin has written a wonderful biography of Bill, and I'm sure he'd be very happy to sign copies for you here.
More books.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay, Mike, one, you got the last question tonight.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you for to all for being here today. Sure, I speak for everyone when I say we all appreciate your public service, and that goes for Mr. Paikin as well. I'd like to ask a question about an institution that has been part of Ontario's democracy since 1867, and that's the Ontario Liberal Party. Where does it go from here? Why or why not will it end up like the Liberal parties in the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta? Thank you.
Wonderful question, very timely. This is the first time since the 1940s, in which there were 3 elections in that decade, that the Liberals have come last unofficial party status twice. 2 of the 3 elections in the 40s, and now back-to-back, 2018, 2022. Discuss. Okay, Dalton McGuinty, start us off.
I'm very optimistic. And
in spite of everything.
In spite of everything, I think David has said it a few times, don't read too much into this one election. I think it's a function of some very unique prevailing circumstances. So the view that's been articulated by some is that, well, you should join together with the NDP, and I disagree with that. And I'll try to give you some practical examples.
It's your finance minister who's putting forward that idea, Greg Sorbera.
He's always been helpful. Always been helpful.
That's very tactful.
I love him. I really do. So the NDP would say, listen, we want to sit down and work with poverty activists. I would say, so do we, but to that mix, I want to sit down with the Chambers of Commerce. The NDP would say, I want to work with environmentalists. I would say, so do we, but I also want to speak to green tech innovators. The NDP would say, we're absolutely committed unconditionally to the best public schools and the best publicly funded healthcare system. And I would say, so do we, but we're also very concerned about a strong economy, so we have the capacity the fiscal capacity to fund those programs and other social services. So we'll find a way. It might take a bit of time, but we'll find a way. I thought we did, we came up with, a quarter of the vote. I thought we did exceptionally well, given, the challenge that was faced by Stephen Del Duca. And I think he's done the right thing by letting go at this point in time, and I'm confident we're going to find a new leader and rebuild. And the other point I would make, Stephen, if I may, is I think it's really important at a time when there are those who appeal to polarization, and maybe people may be pulled toward that polarization of their own accord. We need a strong centrist party. If I'm on the left, I'm going to have a really hard time working with somebody on the right, and vice versa. But if there's somebody in the middle, then maybe I can be part of a coalition where we can build things together.
Bob Rae, you're in a unique position among this group of 5 to speak about this. Whither the Liberals in Ontario?
I don't really know, but I think that Dalton oversimplifies the situation when he implies that the New Democratic Party is not interested in what business does, or he's not interested in, if you talk to poverty activists, you want to talk to the Chamber. I inherited a structure of Premier's councils from Premier Peterson, and we broadened them just to do just that. So I mean, I'm not sure there's a will in either party to merge. I don't get that vibe from my friends in both parties, and I still do have friends in both parties. But we'll see. I don't think we should think that institutions can't change or that there can't be different formations, frankly, depending on the willingness to change the electoral system. But I just don't get the sense that the two parties are actually ready to change very much in terms of the institutional connection with one another. And having been a member of both parties, I would say that they're different. They're not the same. But they each have strengths and they each have weaknesses. When David Peterson and I reached our agreement in 1985, we decided that it was important to make a change, and we decided that it was important to have a common agenda. And our party had no difficulty accepting the agenda, and neither did Mr. Peterson's. And speaking of which, he fulfilled the agenda to a considerable degree in the 2-year period that it applied. So I don't rule it out, but I also think it's going to take a lot more momentum and discussion, and frankly, breaking down some of the stereotypes that exist in both parties about what the others are really like. And I think that may or may not happen.
David Peterson, how do you like the name Liberal Democrats of Ontario?
Not particularly, but thank you for asking. I don't forget there's a deep history here. And people, and there is a value system around the NDP and the Liberals and the Conservatives. I understand there's lots of fuzziness at the edges, and I understand that, you know, a left-wing Tory could easily be a Liberal, and a Liberal could easily be a Tory. There's lots of people going back and forth, and that's okay. I think a pragmatic response based on just expedience today would be a terrible mistake. This would be the kind of thing you would have to discuss for years, and impossible to do just at a provincial level. If it happened at a national level, that's a different story, but it would probably spin off other parties, the extreme left or the extreme right, from these various parties, and people would switch. So I think it's easy to say, almost impossible to do. And it would be almost like stripping the war medals off some people to say your party is going to have to merge now. So if it's going to happen, this is going to have to be bottom up. We're going to have to listen very carefully.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think that there's not a culture of, or there's not a feeling right now in the two parties that they want this to happen. I think that if there is a groundswell, it is going to come from younger people. It's going to come from people who are not part of the party structure at this point. And I also think that having that continuum of parties, I agree with Dalton. You know, I think that it is important. If we're talking about an increasingly polarized political landscape, do we actually want to further polarize? Do we actually want to have two main parties? I think that's a question. My answer to it would be no. I think that one of the shields against that polarization that we have in this province and in this country is that we have a continuum of ideologies and perspectives.
Is it fair to say, Ernie Eves, you love it just the way it is? Because as long as there's two center-left parties splitting the vote, the Tories are very happy campers.
Well, I think it's worked several ways. It's benefited every one of the three major parties at one time or another. I think that it's very important to our system and the history of the province that we have three traditional parties. And I might say now the Green Party, I think I regard as a very significant force, especially among young people going forward. I think that's all very important. If I was a Liberal, which I'm not, I don't think I'd be in favor of, you know, ending my party and joining with the NDP. As David has said, in virtually every party, you can find people that are more left-wing leaning and more right-wing leaning, maybe to various degrees. You know, when I became Minister of Finance, I became a great personal friend and supporter of many of the policies that Paul Martin wanted to do at the federal level. I supported reforming the Canadian pension plan And he was astounded that I would speak out. I think he thought I was some right-wing cyclops from the Paris government. And you know, we became great friends. In fact, we had many dinners together. He would accuse me of being in the wrong party, and I would accuse him of being in the wrong party. And I think that speaks to...
What did he say?
He said you're both right.
I think that really speaks to what our system is all about.
Don't forget, there are pragmatic solutions to this.
Right.
We've seen them. Bob was talking about the Accord. Yeah. Most people think that was a pretty mature way to handle the situation, and it enjoyed wide public support. The recent, they've made accommodations in British Columbia with the Greens, appropriate to those circumstances. They've made appropriate arrangements between the NDP and the Liberals in Ottawa, commensurate with the circumstances. There are lots of flexibility in this system, and people have demonstrated they can work together. So I don't despair about that, Stephen. I think each election is unique. Somebody has momentum, somebody doesn't. Somebody's in survival mode, somebody's in aggression mode, and you have to hope those people can all find common interests to make the system work. And it's working in Ottawa. You may not like it, but it's working.
Indulge me one last minute to thank all of you for coming to Mars today. Indulge me to thank Mars for hosting us so generously and wonderfully here today. Indulge me in thanking our technical crew here who shot this whole thing today, and our executive producer at The Agenda, Stacey Dunseith, who is a superstar. I call her Khaleesi because she is the mother of dragons. I thank the Wilson Foundation for their wonderful underwriting of what we've attempted to do today. And finally, I want to thank these five who had the guts to put their names on a ballot once upon a time and offered themselves up for public service and have been very kind to this television station today in joining us here for this. And I know you want to join me in thanking them for being with us today. Thank you, everybody. So long.